All right, Nehemiah chapter 3. Let's focus this week's set of lessons around the concept of building, because even though I might not have specifically said it, of course, Ezra and Nehemiah are two books that are devoted to the rebuilding of Jerusalem as the people of Israel come back from exile in waves. And this Nehemiah wave is going to be devoted to rebuilding the wall through the adversity of the people of the land, as we said in previous weeks, who weren't eager to see Israel return after having been free of their presence for roughly 70 years. And so as we see Nehemiah now having returned to Israel, having spied out the wall, he is now going to have the assistance of the people who are now motivated to work on the wall. And this is basically a list of names in chapter 3, but even though it might be similar to other genealogies or lists of names that we've seen in the past, they kind of break down in this chapter into three categories. One, who is building; two, where they're building; and in some circumstances, what they are repairing or implementing to get those repairs done. We'll take it in reverse order. The times when they're talking about what they're implementing, they'll talk about those who are primarily working on gates, sometimes dealing with beams, doors, bolts, and bars, but the three that are going to recur are the beams, the bolts, and the bars that they repair at the gates. The locations, though, are, in addition to the gates, what we would call some touristy areas, maybe, specifically looking at some areas around verses 15 on through roughly 19 or maybe even 20. It's going to talk about the king's garden, the tombs of David, and the house of the mighty men, going back to those times when at the end of David's life, they gave a list of his mighty men, men of great renown who often had great accomplishments attached to their names when they were described in those chapters. And so those are some of the spots that for me would be tourist attractions, and that is what they are rebuilding now. And so I can't help but imagine that as they are rebuilding, it's possibly coming to mind not only what they lost, but the great history that they can look forward to if they can rebuild and overcome, as we've said, the adversaries who are trying to keep them from progressing. But in getting there, the names were what caught my attention most. And it's a group of people that come from a varied list of backgrounds. Everybody from goldsmiths and perfumers. Also talked about merchants and then rulers of the different districts. And the people who set it off were not those who originally came back with Ezra, understanding that we mentioned they came back in phases. And the first phase of folks whose hearts God started to come back were the builders who rebuilt the temple first before Ezra came back to begin to rebuild the character of the nation. Now that Nehemiah has come back to rebuild the wall, the people, however, who set it off in the beginning in verse 1 are as follows. Then Eliashib, the high priest, rose up with his brothers, the priests, and they built the sheep gate, which caught my attention because of the subtitle that I might have forgotten to mention for this chapter, which was disaster relief. Because the priest reminded me of times after Hurricane Harvey when I got a chance to come back home to Houston and help with the disaster relief and see people coming in from all over the country to help us rebuild the city. One of the things I noticed that whether it was folks coming from out of town or folks who were in town, you might not have gotten to know who people really were, at least in terms of their profession, until you got a break or an opportunity to break bread with them and got a chance to find out, oh, this person is such and such, or this person does so and so for a living. And you found out all the different areas in which folks were not specifically skilled in doing the demolition that had to take place before we could start helping people to rebuild. But people were simply willing to volunteer outside of their skill set so that they could come together as one, a term that's going to come up later in our reading this week, a term we've also seen in previous week's readings that I didn't emphasize, but it really seemed to come together in this passage where all of these people with diverse skill sets came together to learn what they needed to learn, to build what they needed to build, to get one objective done, and that's building the wall around Jerusalem. But beyond disaster relief in organizations and especially churches, the ones that seem to be most effective are the ones that don't leave that mentality in the context of disaster relief, but they bring that to their daily, being willing to step up in any area, in many ways, giving us a throwback to that whole concept of slash, what we saw out of the Levites in previous chapters, where they were willing to step up to fill in any role that was necessary. We're now getting to see that mentality spread out to the rest of Israel, and even to this day. I have seen the payoff in return be this. Some of the most multi-talented people I think I have met are those who have been willing to step up in multiple areas, and especially in the church. It's one thing for me to develop my talents to the best of my ability, but I'm at my best when I think I'm learning the same things I've seen some of these men of God learn, and that is we're at our best when God is adding a blessing to our talents. And so some of the most talented people I've seen in the church especially are those in whom over time God developed a variety of talents because they made themselves available to help with a variety of needs.